Hello and welcome to the virtual SMB Summit on multidimensional cyber communications. It's more than just notification and compliance. My name is Jack Healey, and I am the CEO of Bear Hill Advisory Group. Bear Hill Advisory Group is a business risk, process improvement, and interim CFO services organization. And we help companies get through their most difficult times. We write cybersecurity incident response plans, as well as ethical plans, fraudulent recovery, embezzlement, product recall, as well as a host of other things. I am a certified fraud examiner. I'm a certified public accountant and member of InfraGuard, which is the coalition of cooperative between business and the FBI. Today's discussion is going to cover cybersecurity communications. It's one of the areas during a cyber incident response plan that I think gets short attention. The more sophisticated companies will have a separate cyber incident response plan, and they'll also have a separate cyber incident communication plan. The communication plan is usually as thick or thicker than the incident response plan because it includes examples of communications, and it also covers more scenarios than a typical cyber incident response plan. Today we're going to talk about those dimensions in a communication plan, the role of the 3 C's. We're going to talk about message maps, and talk about how we communicate. We're going to have some samples, as well as we're also going to tie all of this back to NIST. NIST, cyber incident response, is one of the methodologies that's out there. There are several. There's COVID, and they're all about the same. There are some differences, but when you talk about the area of communications, it's easy to assimilate from one to another. So we start off with a quote by Dr. Henry Kissinger. There can't be a crisis next week. My calendar is already full. None of us ever plans for a crisis. They seem to happen. The last time I had a surprise, it was on my 7th birthday. That was a good one. So usually surprises are bad. And so what we want to do is we want to be prepared for those surprises. So think about breaches. I made a list here. There are 50 companies that have announced that they were breached in the first quarter of 2020. If you look at that list, you'll notice some familiar names that are on there. T-Mobile. Marriott has the distinction of being on that list more than once. They had 2 breaches, one, I believe, in December that they announced in January, and then another one in March of this year. Under the heading I labeled booty, that is what the bad guys walked away with. So it might be personally identifiable information, or PII, or protected healthcare information, PHI, which is medical records. The bad guys have also started to take biometrics. You'll see that on there. And passports are always a reason for the bad guys to try to get their hands on records. That's why they go after the affinity programs for airlines and for hotels, because many times passports are held there. But if you look through that, you can also see there was some credit card fraud and also some other items on there. J.Crew, I noticed, is also on there twice. When we look at the breach statistics, and this is from the 2019 Verizon breach report, the 2020 report will come out this month. But you'll look at the different percentages of hacking and social attacks, malware. There is a higher preponderance to, whether it's ransomware or malware, that phishing is normally the first area that the bad guys try to infiltrate you. And they'll do it through cold calling, and they call that cold confidence reading. And they will actually call a organization and see how many internal operating details it can get out of you. They'll find out what web browser you use. They'll find out what hardware you're using, and they'll even try to get you to download something on the phone. But if you look at 71% of the breaches are financially motivated. They don't do this for sport. They really do this to get money. Everybody always asks, well, what's the cost of a breach? And you'll see Dr. Ponemon is out there, and I think he's had, I think last year's was $149 per record. This comes from the insurance industry. And the industry looks at it differently. And in fact, they say the per record metric is a poor metric. And you'll see on the side why. The number of records aren't necessarily a determinant factor, but the type of record, the industry, and the mitigation processes that you had in place to stop them from getting that. But to read this chart, if you had 100,000 records stolen, you're 96% confident you're going to spend $10,000 to remediate that. 79.8%, you're going to spend over 100,000. About 50%, you're going to spend $1 million, and you might spend 10 million. And this is what the industry, this is through actual claims. And so these are in recent numbers. This is as of March of this year, put out by VERIZON and the Scientia Institute. So why do we communicate? We want to organize a response. We need all the pieces to fit together. So if I'm sending out something internally, and then I communicate to my customers, and then I communicate with regulators, I want to make sure that those stories flow together. Now, some may be evolving. You'll have several communications internally, and that'll happen over time as the breach becomes, or the incident becomes better known. At some point, you'll reach out to your customers, and when you reach out to your customers, you're most likely reaching out to the regulators. So you don't want to have anything in this stream that's going to contradict itself. You'll communicate to inform your customers, suppliers, stakeholders. You'll communicate to update the matters as they merit. And of course, to meet statutory requirements, which we touch on in this, but remember, the whole purpose of this presentation is to focus on the other two types of communications. And also, we're going to talk about addressing the emotions and anticipate the questions. So the emotions, we'll cover that a little bit of your audience. What are they thinking? And you need to make sure that in your communications that you're able to address those emotions. So a guiding principle of communication is we always try to identify the facts as quickly as possible. And that's the hardest thing to do because it's very hard to determine what is a fact in the beginning of a breach. We want to understand why we're communicating. It's called the 5 whys. And you should ask yourself 5 times the question why you're communicating. So we want to send out a email or to all of our customers telling them we've been breached. Why? Well, they may be trying to communicate with us, or they may be trying to order. Okay, well, right then you may say, well, why do I have to talk to all of them when some of them might be trying to order? Is there another way to communicate? So if you can successfully answer that question five times as to why, it's probably a pretty good idea to communicate. But as you ask yourself these questions, as I did in my example, you'll see that you may morph a little bit. So the second why was, okay, I want to communicate to some of my customers. Why? Because they're going to try to communicate, buy from us. Why? Because they buy over the internet. Okay, and then where are we going to put that notice? So is it going to be on the internet? We're going to create pre-written messages. So that's part of our plan. We're going to be editing. We're not going to be drafting. And another principle is to leverage our intelligence networks for critical metrics. And our intelligence network would be anything from social media to our friends in the press, to getting feedback from the call center, from customer relations, So that's our intelligence network that we have. And of course, we're going to update as circumstances change. So we don't communicate. We don't want to assess blame or minimize or deflect from the magnitude. We don't want to provide false hope that we understand that magnitude. Never tell anybody you know how they feel. That's usually a bad item. And also, if you don't understand, you don't want to appear more in control than you really are. So you don't want to say, okay, we've got this handled, and you don't, because then when it comes out that there's more bad news that you hadn't told them and you weren't aware about, then you've lost all credibility. You want to know versus think versus hope. So any statement that you made, you want to make sure you know. And if you don't know, you think or you hope, you don't want to communicate. And you don't want to communicate just to mitigate liability. Mitigation of liability is a byproduct of effective communications. It's not the reason for the communication. Let me say that again. Mitigation of a liability is a byproduct of effective communications. It is not the reason to communicate in itself. So we don't want to say statements that we know aren't true, that we know the depth of the breach, that we know how they'll be impacted. And unless we know the mitigation that we're offering, we don't want to offer that mitigation until we know the total scope. So let's say that we offer credit monitoring, which is kind of standard nowadays, but then we find out that bank accounts were actually breached. Well, are we going to make whole those bank accounts? Well, no, the bank will, but as in the case of Target and Home Depot, I'm certain the banks will then go back after you. Don't want to say you know how they feel, and please avoid this event will not define us. That's the CAN, crisis management lingo. Whenever somebody hears that, they know that a PR firm is behind all this. It usually rings hollow. Long-term brand impact of breaches has been minimal, with the exception of a couple of companies that it actually put out of business. Most cyber events do wear off over time. We still shop at Target, we still shop at Home Depot, we still report things to Equifax. So in this, we have a cyber incident response plan, and the plan is our roadmap. It tells us what we're supposed to do, when we do it, and who should do it. And the who should do it is not a group. It's not calculate the benefits to be received from insurance. It wouldn't be risk management. It would be a name and the vice president of risk management. And then we'd also have a backup, because you can't have an incident response plan assuming everybody is going to be in the office that day. Some people take vacations, they're sick, so you always want an alternate. So the communication plan, though, is integrated into this roadmap, and it says what to say and not say. It tells who to say it and when to say it. All right, so the communication plan then marries up with the incident response plan. So communication should be part of that incident response team. It's usually a subset. It's usually the cyber communication incident response team is its name. And they also need to be part of that team so they have the unvarnished information. They start monitoring social media, and fuzzy matches is where you'll use a $ instead of an S, because people won't spell a bad word like shoot. They'll spell it with a $ and maybe zeros. So you want to make sure that you have a group that will monitor that for you. There are companies that do that for you pretty inexpensively. Just don't have somebody in the office monitor your Facebook, Twitter, and other blogs out there. You want to have this professionally done if you can afford that. You want to monitor the press, and we're going to talk about making sure we had contacts in the press. And we want to look at our pre-written messages that we've already drafted. So we're going to start crafting a more detailed message, and we're going to be looking at that as we start to work on our incident response. So we have our communications as part of our cyber incident response team. And on that team, we typically have the CEO, the CIO or CISO. So you need whoever's in charge of the breach on the communications team. Now, they're not going to spend all their time on it. It's normally led by the communications or sometimes a PR firm, but make sure it's a crisis management. Always have an internal person leading it. Do not abdicate the lead to an outside party. And you'll see legal's part of it, and investor relations and HR. And if you think about it, that handles a lot of the constituents. You might also have the CFO, if you think the banking and the finance world's important. Legal is not the leader for coordinating crisis communications. Legal is the leader when we talk about the area of notification and regulatory requirements. But when we're talking about coordinating in crisis communications, which are 2 of the 3 C's, we do not want a lawyer leading that up because they're very good at mitigating risk, but the purpose of those 2 communications are different. You want to have a relationship with the media, law enforcement, and regulators, inspector generals, or your representatives in Congress. You want to know, you want to have those relationships. You don't want to be making those relationships. And of course, you're going to have those draft communications of the message maps. So need to be prepared that nothing is private, everything leaks. So do not send anything out. You can write confidential for internal purposes only. I've heard CEOs say, well, they better not let this loose or they're going to lose their job. And then all of a sudden he sends it out to 1,500 associates. It winds up on Twitter, and then they start the Captain Quill, who ate strawberry ice cream and who let that out. And so that we can have retribution, and we're taking valuable resources to go hunt down a leak. So just assume it's going to leak. Pressure is always to disclose more than you know, and you need to fight that pressure. And you also don't want to be positioning your story by others. So you want to set the tone. You want to position your story. You're the victim of a crime. You're doing your best. You've hired outside experts. You don't know the depth of that crime. As soon as you know, they will know. You're asking for their patience. You're diligent. Your customers mean more to you than anything, as well as your associates. And this goes for whether it's an internal breach and you've lost your employees, PII or PHI, or your customers, or you've been the victim because one of your suppliers was breached. And it doesn't matter who was breached. If it's the customer's data, they're going to look at you. Again, we're going to monitor social media. There are three C's. The first is coordination, and that's how we communicate with each other inside the group. Coordinating communications can go outside the group with our lawyers, our insurance providers, our communications, law enforcement. So coordinating the response. So the coordination, it's primarily internal, but it can reach external. Crisis communications are those communications we typically have outside the organization. And that's when we talk to customers, suppliers, bankers, stakeholders. And then we have the compliance. And the compliance is what most people are familiar with and what they focus on when they hear about cyber communications. And you see the law firms will put them on and they'll dazzle you, as I will, in this with the myriad of different rules out there. In fact, one of the giveaways at the end is I've compiled from a law firm's website. As of this month, I went ahead and downloaded the 110 pages of every state in their requirements. But you should always use that as a guide, but consult your attorney. I also include in that several examples of other companies' communications. And some of their message maps are excellent. We're going to go over some of those. So our coordinating communications is the unvarnished information that we get from our cyber response team. Executive management will want written and oral communication detailing the cyber incident response and action plans. They're going to want something that they can turn around and they can give, that they can talk from. You want to make sure they don't steer very far from that. You want to make sure that they've been trained to say only what's on that talking point. So you've seen people on TV. Politicians are usually great at it. They have their talking points, and no matter what question is asked them, they repeat one of their talking point, even if it doesn't answer the question. That's somewhat the mode you're in at that point. And you want to reiterate that. You don't want to freewheel it as you go through it. You want to evaluate the appropriateness and traction of the messages that you're sending out, and you get that by feedback, by monitoring the social media. Intelligent network could be your customer service center. It could be the people in the warehouse. It could be spouses. It could be friends. It could be, hey, I know you put this message out there, but boy, it sure sounded like you guys don't have a clue what's going on. Well, we try to be honest, yeah, but you don't want to be honest to the point that you invoke fear. And we'll talk about emotions here in a moment. And we're going to work with our C-suite operational leads. Okay, so when you come up with what you think is a communication, you don't want your brand managers or your district managers or your presidents of the division or your frontline people, you don't want them hearing those messages for the first time when they're sent out. You're going to want to preview those messages to those folks and say, look, this is what we're going to send out. Do you see any issues with this? And if they look at the piece of paper and they read it quickly and they go, no, this looks fine, take a step back and say, look, I want to give you 5 minutes with it. Because those are sometimes the folks will come back to you after you've already released and said, I thought about, you used the word theft. And I don't think we can use the word theft because, and they'll have a reason why they didn't like that word. So our first truism is that half of what we know at the beginning of a crisis is wrong. You just don't know what you have. So we really don't know what's going on in the beginning of a crisis. And so we want to make sure that we've got a handle on all the spectrum of feelings. And I call this the beach ball. It's Plutchik's wheel of emotions, or Plutchik's. But if you ever hold up a beach ball and you look at it as that little cone in the bottom, depending on where you look, you see a certain color. All right. And then, but if you look from the beach ball from the top, which is that bigger picture, you'll see that it's not really one color, it's several colors. And each color in this diagram represents different emotions that you can see on there. And the question is, during a coordinating communication, we want to address certain emotions. And so, of course, we're going to have, it could be rage and anger. We could have admiration, trust, acceptance. That's the, I know them, they have everything under control. We don't have to worry about it. And in some breaches, that is the case. In others, though, you'll have terror, fear, apprehension. It was my PII that was stolen, or this was our biggest customer. I'm in sales, and it was my biggest customer that got breached. Am I going to lose that? There's also the amazement, surprise, and distraction. Distraction is a big item. That's why you have a team that focuses on this and not the whole organization. And then the last one, of course, is grief, sadness, and pensiveness. So we want to make sure that we handle all of those emotions at the same time. The way we do that, of course, I talked about NIST. That's the diagram on the right. It's the incident response life cycle. Any of you who are in the cyber incident response space will recognize that as the preparation phase, the detection and analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and post-incident activity. So each element of the plan will deal with several of these functions, and I'm going to go through those in the following slides. So the coordinating communications will apply to all elements. So we're going to talk about coordinating in the preparation, the detection, the containment, and post-activity. Crisis communication usually applies to the detection, containment, eradication, and recovery. If you think about it, it's that middle two. And then compliance is usually detection and post-incident. There may be some requirements to report compliance at different phases, but those are definitely two of the areas where compliance has to be looped in, because, as I said, compliance is led by the legal department, and the legal team will determine when they need to announce that. So communication plan, this is a simple one that shows the table of contents of what you want to look at, the overview, the guide, the basic key message points, the sub-messages, the intended audience, the internal and external, those are listed, the timing, the follow-up communications, what are the key attributes that leads to a follow-up communication. We're not just doing it ad hoc. It could be a function of time. It could be a function of an event. And it's usually a combination of the two. We just don't communicate to communicate unless we have not talked to the group in a while. I'm going to go over Wendy's has their communications, and their first one was for a credit card breach. Their first communication was in 2016 in June, I believe, and then their final one was in July of 2018. So they communicated for over 2 years, updating the website. Who's authorized to speak? You'll have a primary and a secondary, and those people ought to be trained. The CEO many times wants to be out front. It depends is the answer on that one, and only if you have to. I'd rather have the CEO to have some wiggle room. That's why presidents have press secretaries, even though the secretary is usually saying what they were told to by the president. If something said goes awry, they can always have some distancing from that statement, and that's just usually helps. Now, if it's a bad enough event, then the initial video may be made by that CEO, as Equifax did, but we all know how that worked out for that particular gentleman. No fault of his own, I will say. That was a horrendous breach, and unfortunately, a lot of people went to school on Equifax on that size of that breach, but they did the best with what they had at the time as far as communicating and trying to rectify the breach. And then we have the feedback, monitoring, the methods, frequencies. So you'll also see in the communication plans, they typically have a more detailed overview of the objective, scope, assumptions, life plan, life cycle, which means how long are we going to keep this plan until we have to revise it, and then the communication cycle. What do we consider a communications from beginning to end? When do we know we should stop communicating? And then we have the team roles and the RACI chart, and everybody in management should be familiar with the responsible, accountable, and coordinated, and consulted, and informed. But you have that for each section and each person. The team activation matrix that we'll discuss. We have the response procedures, planning, alerting, triage, investigation. Those are the aligned with the NIST, the pre-approved message maps, the internal communications, external, and then social media, rumor control response. So that's why I said this document tends to be as big as a cyber incident response plan or larger. And so when we think about this and the coordinating aspects, we want to be able to answer several items. We want to know, what should I be doing? Why am I doing it? What will you be doing? How long do I do whatever you're asking me to do? How will I know when I'm done? When will you talk with me next? And what do I do if I have questions? So when you're coordinating with somebody, those are typically the questions that you have to answer to internal folks. Now at the senior executive level, this happens in shorthand, but when you go down and let's say customer service, you need their help. You need customer service to monitor the people calling in about this incident, because many times a breach will happen and a help desk ticket will be filled out by several different customer care folks. It'll be the same problem, and it's not until it hits the security desk that somebody notices it's the same problem from several different customers. They then know it's not a one-off problem, it's a systemic problem. So you may be asking them to monitor that. So those are the type of things you want to be able to answer. This is an escalation matrix. An escalation matrix is the escalation of the event. So if we look at the left-hand side, we have the impact, whether it's software, database, access, brand and reputation, an operational and functional issue, data recovery, or enterprise support action. So the enterprise support actions are the teams that we have looking at that. This comes from an actual client. So their yellow is IT. It's basically the IT folks handle everything in that, routine comments regarding the company, no minimal impact in the organization. Time to recover data is predictable. And then that second area is where your communication teams on this particular item, the communications team is the CCCT. And you'll notice that they're starting to get involved at the second level. So they're beginning to monitor whether or not the operational issues are ones that need to be elevated to a crisis communication or coordinating communications. Normally, that second level does not require compliance and notification. It could be if we lost a laptop and the laptop was unencrypted. Yes, it's a severe item. It's a one-off. But if the information on that laptop included no PII, it was some spreadsheets with financial information, then it wouldn't need to be necessarily notified to internal company financial information. It wouldn't necessarily have to be notified to the regulators or anybody. So the second level is you're on deck, and then obviously if it's severe, the communication. And so if you look at data recovery, ransomware is the most common. All data is lost, it's missing, it's been manipulated, inability to access it, recoverably not possible. And you'll see data exfiltrated, and we talk about using English words. The IT folks love that word. It just basically means that the data has left the room, has left the building, it's been stolen. So that's an escalation matrix. You need to have one of those for your plan as well as communication plan. An example of somebody who did not have one, again, I'll use Equifax. If you recall, IT went right to executive leadership. So we went from the yellow right to executive leadership, which is hanging out in that red zone. And then they held on to it for a while, and then they went back to the blue zone. And the blue zone is where most of your middle management and your response team resides. And there was a number of weeks, not days, weeks between those two events. So this brings it from IT, goes to middle management or executive management who's handling the crisis, and then it goes to the executive team. All right. So let's talk about the prepared part of NIST and coordinating. We think about the different scenarios and we anticipate those messages. So prepared means an event has not occurred. So that's all we're doing is we're sitting around, we're focusing on what instruments, what we're going to need in order to handle a breach. And we're going to, during that time, think through it. You saw a dark channel on there. Dark channel has to do with not necessarily your normal channels of communication. So that might be monitoring, do we have the ability to monitor the dark web? Do we know people that can monitor blogs for us and that sort of thing? But at that point, it's just being prepared. And we've talked a lot about that in the previous slides. So here you see the detection. It's usually the first 24 to 48 hours. Who's been impacted, you think, because you don't know. Remember, half of everything we know is wrong. We just don't know which half. We want to communicate to the leadership and coordinate with IT security. We want to verify the classification. Is it an incident? Is it operational or security? Operational tends to be that things are not working correctly. Data is not available. We could have a corruption. We could have a bad app. We could have a denial of service where we just don't have access to those items. Security is one where we believe that that our information in one way or another has been compromised by unauthorized contact. So unauthorized contact is really is really one of the key triggers for the security. So we're going to have a map of our game plan. We're going to decide what our communication strategy is at that point with legal, and we're going to start planning. So it's been detected. We have a bunch of people working on it. We're trying to decide whether or not we need to communicate. And at this point, our internal communications remind the organization of our communication protocols. So at this point, we're going to sit, and whether we're communicating to a wider group or just executive team, everybody gets reminded at this point that we have a plan. And this strategy is always dynamic. It's not set in stone. So if what we plan to do isn't working, we're going to amend it. So we're going to have our internal communications at this time. We'd notify them that the cyber incident response plan has been activated, refer them back to their training that they've had, hopefully. We're going to generally discuss the incident. We're going to stick to what we know. We're not going to guess. We're going to use it in CIA, which is a risk data discussion, which is confidentiality. Has that been breached? The availability or the integrity of the data. So it's usually, or completeness. So we want to know what's been happening there, and that's how we want to communicate it. We describe the systems that may be impacted, and then give specific instructions as we want them to do. And of course, remind them that only authorized people can talk to the media. Part of the internal communication is ensure the group that customers that are impacted or third parties are going to be talked to. We don't want them talking to them. We may ask for their help in talking to them, but at this stage, please only let that come from authorized people. We're going to ask for the help in monitoring and provide a method for feedback. We're going to give a schedule for their next update, which would be most likely live over the phone. We don't want a lot of written communication, and some of this is discoverable. Actually, most of this is discoverable with the exception of our facts and thoughts and decisions that we made for that. So we don't want to have a lot of things in writing where we don't have to. And the best way to do that is to hold teleconferences. I want to reiterate that we've been prepared for this, and now is time to pull together. So if you go back to those emotions that I talked about before, about the angst, anger, the confusion, and all these other things, we want to try to address those when we're talking to them internally. And of course, we want to reinforce the pride and the brand in the team. So during the eradication, recovery, and coordination, the coordination communications, this is the high stress time. This is when things are moving around quite a bit. This is where we're finding which half of our initial assumptions were wrong. We may have said something that we wish we hadn't have said. So at this point, we're trying to bridge the difference of what we said. We have to, where practical, make those internal updates in person, via phone, and we have to have a clear release protocol. Who's going to say what and have the final release to the authorities. Which brings us to our second truism. If you're explaining, you're losing. So if somebody has to explain their actions, why they did something, they're losing the battle with the public. You shouldn't be spending a lot of time. The best example of that is when companies get called before Congress to answer questions. Well, they spend the entire time explaining. I've never seen anybody go in front of Congress and come away not looking worse than when they walked in the door. So when we talk about the emotions that we have during the crisis phase, what are we trying to address? We have the annoyance, anger, rage again. We have loathing, disgust. I don't think boredom will be one, but we have loathing and disgust, sadness, grief. We have surprise, distraction. And then a new one, we have interest, anticipation, and vigilance. Again, now at this point, I'm being told, I'm a customer, I'm being told there was a breach. I now have to be vigilant. I have to be looking for, make sure that my records are safe. I'm not happy with you because you lost my records. I'm pretty mad. And so I want to make sure that your messaging hits those points. So first thing we want to understand is, do we want to provide a statement? Words have meaning. Incident is different than breach. Breach usually means that it was an unauthorized access, and that the bad guys got in, and they usually got something of value. They weren't in there for mischief. An incident can be denial of service, where they just mucked up our operational capabilities. They didn't take anything. They just made our lives uncomfortable. Lawyers will help you choose those words. They tend not to want you to use the word breach in some instances. We want to use words that people understand. I pointed out that word exfiltrate, and IT will say that's what happened, and you just have to say, yeah, nobody knows what that word is. So what we do is we try to write at a 4th grade level. It's usually the best way to handle that. And if you can do that, and typically you'll then show these messages to somebody else in the organization who had nothing to do with the drafting of that. So it could be somebody in the warehouse, it could be somebody in accounting, it could be somebody in HR, it could be anybody who had somebody in marketing, somebody who had nothing to do with writing it, to see if they understand it. We want to know our priorities. The associates have to be informed and armed with frequently asked questions. They've got to have them. And they need to understand that they're going to answer the questions they know. And if they don't know the answer, then they go ahead and they refer that up to the duty officer. That's usually the way it worked in the military. If you didn't know the answer to something you don't guess, you usually ask the next person higher up. Customer should be your touchstone. And what you would want as a supplier to a customer, you'd be thinking as a supplier to your customer, what will your customers want and what do they need in this situation? Need to control those communications. Simultaneously, we want to go out to the attorney generals and the regulators as a rule. You don't want them to be surprised. If you go out and you're talking to your customers, now if it's one customer and you have a good relationship with them and it's just the two of you, and you put your legal department in touch with their legal department, and it's a team process, and you've notified law enforcement, then you may not have to go to an AG. But if you're contacting a group of customers, you most likely want to go out and let the AGs know about it, because you don't want the customers telling them before you do. And then be prepared for the press. Be prepared for that phone call. So our communications need to address their concerns, as we've talked about, with their emotions, their concerns, what happened, what are we going to do for them? Remember, it is all about them. When will we talk to them next? And you're going to decide ahead of time, when you have a communication plan and a cyber incident response plan, you've already decided whether or not you're going to help them freeze their credit, which is preferable to credit monitoring. You'll also wind up providing credit monitoring. That's just what people do. But you want to talk them through freezing their credit, which anybody on this call, you should always have your credit frozen. If you need to go get a loan, it's very easy to unfreeze and refreeze your credit, and it's now free. It used to be anywhere from $3 to $10 per account, but now it's free. So you should be doing that. You want to know how they should be talking to you. Is it through the web? Is it through a call center? Or are you going to call them directly at a higher level? And then you're going to have written scripts for FAQs for all management with client contact specific to that person. So it's what happened in non-technical speech, who we've engaged to assist us. You'll see that, steps taken and being taken, promises for updates, and don't speculate or guess. So during the detection phase of the crisis, it's confusing. We go into lockdown. We usually don't say a lot during that, unless, of course, the detection came from the press, which has happened many times. Home Depot got a call from Krebs and the Wall Street Journal, and they said they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, that wasn't true. They were working with law enforcement, and law enforcement had asked them not to tell anybody. And so Home Depot came out looking a little bit foolish. Now the story came out months later, but they should have had a better plan on how they were going to handle those items, those requests from the press. And then legal should be part of all decisions. Eradication recovery for crisis communications. We're going to distribute the official messages to business operations and clients. We're going to coordinate with the operational presidents. Again, if it impacts their piece of the business, they need to be read in. They need to approve the message or know the message going out that may not get approval. The CEO is the one who signs off on these. We need to make sure that we have accurate follow-up. crisis in the regulatory post, preparing a fact sheet, and updating the website contemporaneously with what you're telling people. That list of 50 breaches, I started going through it, trying to find their web announcements. I was able to find Landry's. They did a nice job. I'm going to show that to you in a few slides. But there were several, including Greenville's water. You can't find that they even had a breach. It made all the papers. It was announced everywhere. People couldn't pay their water bill. But if you go to their website today, they don't have any mention of it. And a number of these other sites had no mention at all. In order to find Marriott's, you have to go all the way to scroll to the bottom of the page, get to the corporate page, and then I couldn't find it at the face. I actually had to type in the word breach and cyber incident and a bunch of words before it popped up. It's there. It's just buried. So it needs to be a little bit more transparent. Of course, don't forget about the accountants. If you are public, I'm sure your lawyers won't. This could be an 8K event. And dissemination of control. Know who we've released statements to and when. So we're going to have a log, just like we do in a security incident log. And a lot of times, many times, we don't say anything until a full investigation. And that's why you see these delays and breaches. So, we picked on Equifax a little bit. The one piece of that really surprised me is a breach of that size. People said they waited too long to announce the breach, but those of us in the profession really were amazed at how quickly they announced it. Because normally, I think Yahoo took 2 years to announce their first breach. They had a second breach. I think it took them a year to announce that. A number of businesses wait months before they announce it. Now, there are new privacy rules out there and you'll see when we start talking about, I use Massachusetts in a coming up slide, that if you've called law enforcement in, and law enforcement says you can tell somebody, you basically have 7 days from that point. More on crisis communications. We want to close the loop on our message. We just don't want to leave somebody hanging. By closing the loop, you need to say what the resolution of an issue was. You also, say, I will get back to you more on this as information arises. I need to say how I'm going to get back to you. We will have another press release when we learn more. Information will be updated daily on our website. Check back there, that sort of thing. We have addressed the emotional aspects of our audience, and be careful to coordinate with compliance because you don't want to trigger a timeline. You might say something in an email or a letter or a communication to a client that actually starts the clock running in one of these states. And just as a side note, if you're in the healthcare industry or financial industry, HIPAA and FINRA communication rules are different. HIPAA actually requires you to issue a press release. So in the crisis communications, it's very difficult in that. Normally it's your patients, and your crisis communication is almost non-existent. You go right into compliance. And that's sometimes shortchanges the timeliness of the announcement because you need to have a lot more answers than you may have. We want to continue to communicate throughout the investigation when the final report's issued. We also want to talk about what we've learned. That's an important piece of this. If you think about the emotions, am I going to trust you again? As I'm your customer, am I going to trust you again? And Equifax, they announced that they were going to spend $1.3 billion on IT security. Now, I've heard and I've met a number of the folks who have taken over. They happen to have a world-class security department now. And they really have done a phenomenal job. Yes, it was a bad breach. Yes, it happened because they didn't have good patch control. So far, I believe that they've determined that there hasn't been anybody who've had credit taken out because of that breach. Who knows? There's so much information out there, but they really have some of the best professionals out there working for them now. At each step, we want to make sure we're important to our customers and that that similar messages are also sent to the associates. Because remember, even if it didn't affect them in their PII, they still feel, they go to a cookout, and, I've gone to a cookout and there was an internal auditor from Home Depot, and it was right after the breach, and he just went, please don't ask me about the breach. So it impacts people who have nothing to do with the breach at all. We're going to communicate liberally. We're going to blueprint together our facts, and we're going to go through there. I want to spend the few minutes I have left on the message maps. So message map goes into what happened. So questions are on the left, okay? And then the impact, reputational, it could be health and security, it could be informational, the stakeholders that we're writing to, and our key messages. So I'm going to show you some real examples here in a second. So we have our what happened. Our company learned that criminals forced their way into the system, gaining access to employee customer PII, or PHI information. And then the second key message is what information that was. And then the third is that we've hired experts. Has the issue been resolved? And this one, it was yes. We closed the access points the criminals used when they discovered the incident. We've partnered with third-party forensics to make sure that they didn't have any more in there, and we're contacting those people who were exposed. The next one is an actual message map of one of my clients. They actually did email folks. You notice when will I receive my letter in the mail, or they mailed it rather. Many letters have already been sent, but we continue working to identify the individuals who have been impacted. We'll notify all potentially impacted individuals for whom we have valid emailing address. Now they had 3 key messages, but if they go through that, they, I received notification via email, letter about the incident. Does this mean someone stole my personal information? And they go, no, it appears that an unauthorized person forced their way into our system containing confidential file. The intruder may not have been aware the confidential information was stored on our system. And basically they're saying that we're not going to send you emails. So they've thought about this, and then depending on the situation, they just have to go to this message map. They'll modify it for the situation, and they'll be dropping these into announcements. So you may combine 4 of these messages into one announcement, or you may break them out. All right, here's one where NASA was actually communicating with their employees that their PII was stolen. And so they're telling their folks, look, on October 23rd, we had a possible compromise of NASA servers. Now you notice the date is December 18th, so was that 7 weeks or so? Where personally PII was stored. After initial analysis, we determined the information from one of the servers contained social security numbers and other PII to current and former NASA employees may have been compromised. So again, they're not saying it was. They can't rule out that it wasn't, and because of that, under most states, you need to go ahead and announce. Now, there are some states with very liberal PII rules, like some if it only has to do with financial information or information that can be used for financial information. But certainly, Social Security number is something most folks say you have to announce. If you go down a few paragraphs, our entire leadership team makes the protection of personal information very seriously. Information security remains a top priority at NASA. NASA continues efforts to secure all servers. So again, hitting all those hot buttons that we talked about before. Our second quote, all I want is compliance with my wishes after reasonable discussion. So, and this is the compliance end of this. Again, what emotions do we use with compliance? The answer is none. It's just the facts. So because I want to focus more on the other pieces of this, compliance normally gets called in. We have, we get involved with law enforcement and whatnot. So I'm skipping over those slides somewhat, but just know that this is what your lawyers are very well trained in. Now there are privacy laws. You see the California consumer privacy law with GDPRs for Europeans. They change frequently, and legal needs to drive this. And if you're a lawyer, you're getting professional training in this area. If you're not a lawyer, just remember you need to deal with a law firm that does cyber communications and cyber notifications as a rule. And so you want to make sure that that you consult them. Generally, if it wasn't sensitive data or it was encrypted, generally you don't have to notify. And then if it was encrypted, you may not have to. And here's an example in Massachusetts. They define PII as social security number, driver's license, financial account, with or without a password. The person covers are any resident of the Commonwealth who knows of a breach of security or has reason to know it was acquired by an unauthorized person. The encryption, so it does not have apply to encrypted information. You have to know or reasonably know that an authorized user can access it. The timing at the bottom, as soon as practical and without delay, but 7 days after law enforcement has been notified and determined there's been a breach. So 7 days after you've determined there was a breach. I'm going to try this. These are embedded files, see if they work. Okay, so I'm going to quickly pull up another file for you. And we're going to talk about Landry's. Okay, so this was Landry's. They had a notice of a payment card incident. This is on their website. First statement, we take payment card data very seriously. Years ago, beginning in 2016, Landry's installed a payment processing solution that uses end-to-end encryption technology at all Landry's on locations. We're notifying customers of an incident that we recently identified addressed involved payment cards that in rare circumstances appear to have been mistakenly swiped by waitstaff on devices. So that's where they took your card, they have a little handheld, they wipe it, and then they sell that information. So it's really hard it happens a lot in restaurants, and it's hard for them to catch them. Normally they catch them through security cameras, but most people who work in a restaurant know where the blind spots are. And of course, the credit card companies are the ones who will tell you that you've had that problem. Landry's recently detected unauthorized access to the network that supports our payment processing systems, restaurant food and beverage. We immediately launched an investigation, and they go through this. So here's their announcement they go through, and then they start into additional steps you could take. This is fairly standard, and the steps include credit monitoring. If you believe you've been a victim, so you should monitor your credit. I'm not sure they tell you to freeze your account, but you can get a free credit report if you think you've been a victim. Notify the FTC, and then here are the states. If you're in these states, this is your rights, and this is what you should do if you're in those states. They do talk about a security freeze, which is good, and it tells you how to do that. How do I place a freeze on my report? There's no fee to replace or lift a security freeze. Unlike a fraud alert, you must separately place the security freeze in a credit file. Nobody can access that file once you put a freeze on there. Do write down your PIN though, because if you don't have that PIN, you can't unfreeze your credit. Well, you can't do it easily. So, and then they have a lot more information on here. So Landry's approaches it that way. All right, and now we're going to look at I have another one on here. Oh, that was Landry's again. Excuse me. I want to go to Wendy's. So payment card incident, update related to investigation of unusual payment card. So this update's September 28th, and they're updating it starting at the end. They're talking about the class action suit. So remember I talked about you should update them all the way through the end. So they did get sued, and they're actually updating people on that suit. But here it goes back to February 2016. We found evidence of malware. On June 9th, we reported it. So their first notification was in June of 2016. We've issued notification below. We recommend that you remain vigilant. But then they go through all of their FAQs. So what happened? What information was involved? What can I do? Where can I find more information? Then they gave an update. And they started, how do I access the fraud consultation identification resources? What services am I being offered? Will I be automatically charged for the 1 year of complimentary fraud? Will Wendy's ever contact me about my personal financial information? Can someone steal my identity? Was my PIN used? And this was added in July. They did another update, had to do with PINs and CVVs and all that other thing. So, and I hope you saw that. So, as we go through the end here, back to the so I'm sorry, I guess you saw Landry's while I was going through Wendy's. Let me just show you Wendy's very quickly. I apologize for that. So here is the first start, the what happened, and the information. What can we do? If you notice, it just goes on, and you can go to the Wendy's site, or you could get that information that I sent to you, that I will send to you if that's it. So here are our best practices. Always have legal and CEO approved messages, prepare your talking points, know your core anchor messages, coordinate the releases, always inform the state AGs, or they will be called. And here's our crisis management team. You always have to assign somebody who's in charge of blame, fruitless bickering. And then, of course, you have Maureen, who'll be the quiet, patient voice of reason. Eventually, everyone will listen to her after everything else is over with. So here's the contact information for our firm, and to get the multidimensional supplemental information that includes all the 50 states and the territories, the most recent requirements put out by Baker Hofstadter, as well as the Landry example, Wendy's, and a few others, as well as a storage, a sample form. So anyway, I do appreciate you joining me today in the virtual SMB Summit, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.